Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm very fortunate to have Eric Buenas with me today from Equinor. He's the Senior Vice President and Chief Economist there. They recently released their Energy Perspectives, which is always a great opportunity to get Eric to come to Rice. Unfortunately, he'll have to do it virtually this time to speak. I know, Eric, in the future, as soon as you can get here, it'd be great because our students love it when you're here and be able to interact with you. But this year's outlook, I think, will be eye-opening to some people. I know there's a lot of outlooks out there, and certainly the key theme is uncertainty, given what we're emerging from with COVID and very aggressive policies globally to address concerns related to climate change and net zero aspirations, so on and so forth. And I think all of these things will be fodder for discussion as Eric moves through the Energy Perspectives outlook. But what we're going to do today is I'll hand the floor over to Eric. He'll be able to make a presentation for about half the period. And then what we'll do is move directly into Q&A. So if you have questions, please do not hesitate to enter them into the Q&A or the chat. I'll be tracking them both, and we'll definitely get to them as time permits. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to you, Eric. The floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Ken, and thanks for the pleasant introduction and invitation. And good morning, everyone, if you're watching from the time zone close to Houston, or a good afternoon if you're in my time zone. And I'll try and share my presentation here. And you should be able to see the front page of our Energy Perspectives report. So I represent Equinor, which is a large energy oil and gas company based in Norway, with activities in many, many countries, including the United States, with an office in Houston as well. This is the 11th edition of our Energy Perspectives publication, where we try to look out into the future on where global energy markets might go and contribute to a debate, fact-based debate about where energy markets might be going. And of course, it's interesting to do this in the middle of the aftermath of the COVID situation, I should say, and we're still not out of it. Definitely not globally, even though the situation looks definitely better both in Houston and now here in Norway than it did last time we did this, which was in the fall of last year. We had to postpone the 2020 version because of COVID. So this one is our regular date of publication, which is in June. And sorry, I jumped one too many. So just to start out with COVID, that's the starting point. The COVID-19 virus has been and is a massive shock to global economies, to societies, to people, to health systems all over the world. We're not out of it yet, even though the situation now looks to be slightly better than we feared about half a year ago, due to the vaccine rollout, in particular in the industrialized parts of the world, and the massive public stimulus, the fiscal packages to kickstart the economy again. And if you look at the left chart here, you can see that the global GDP crashed basically last year, is now coming back up quicker than we feared. Gas demand is coming back up. Oil demand was, of course, hit the most because the lockdown measures meant less transport, and oil is key to transport. Transport is key to oil. So the crash in oil demand was completely unprecedented. We believe that we will be back to the demand levels in 2019 again sometime next year, slightly earlier than expected, or than feared, I should say. To the right, you can see that this is truly a global crisis. The countries in maroon and pink there are countries with negative economic growth in 2020. And even in the case of China, which didn't have negative growth, the growth is so low that de facto they were also in recession. So this is a very broad global crisis. Fortunately, things are picking up. It's going better. GDP growth in the first quarter of this year, which are these light green ones on an annual basis, were much better, less bad, if you like, than in the first half of last year. Particularly so in China, which didn't fall in the second quarter last year. They fell in the first quarter and then have a fantastic growth now. They got the virus. They were hit first. They got control of the virus, and they're pulling the rest of the world out of recession at the moment. So GDP will come up, and faster than we feared. Global goods trade is already back to where it was. This is going to be a much shorter crisis in terms of trade than the global financial crisis was, which is here we measure it with the months after the start of the crisis, if you like. The nature of the crisis this crisis is much different from the financial crisis. The ability to do something with the policy measures also very different, and that's why it won't last as long. As a consequence of pickup in demand, supply chains that are still affected, we see signals of inflation, commodity price increases, bottlenecks. You can see that to the right in this chart. And there's now a perfect correlation basically between the US consumer price index and the Chinese producer price index, indicating that with continued demand growth, it will take some time before the supply chains have adapted again, and we might actually have a period of much higher price inflation. And we saw that even on solar panels increasing in price in the first part of this year, which is a worry for central banks and governments all over. When economies pick up, energy demand still goes up. We haven't decoupled energy demand from GDP growth and economic activity yet. And since we're completely dependent on fossil fuels, economic growth leads to higher CO2 emissions again. Last year, CO2 emissions fell a lot in many countries, but not in China. It fell during the first quarter, but the actual average level in 2020 were higher than in 2019. And in the rest of the world, CO2 emissions will continue to come up. We see oil demand increasing, gas demand increasing, coal demand is increasing in China. And if you look at the right chart, these are indices of how much we move. And there's still potential to move more. We can still travel more, we can move more. There's significant spare capacity in many economies around the world, which also will then drive energy use, energy demand, and CO2 emissions. So we're not anywhere close to a peak in CO2 emissions yet, unfortunately. And then looking at the potential going forward, the starting point is that we live in a very, very unbalanced world. Those of us that are so lucky that we live in the countries which have the dark colors in this map, we are 15% of the global population. We have access to 2/3 of the purchasing power, global income, and we use close to 40% of the energy. And the lack of global policies in terms of vaccine distribution is a very clear signal that we still live in an unbalanced world. It's also indications of how difficult it is to solve global collective problems in a globally efficient manner. And in the case of this imbalance, I mean, if the rest of the world, the 85% not living in the dark colored countries here, if they were to aspire to our standards of living, we could forget the sustainable development, both in terms of general availability of resources, but also in terms of CO2 emissions and the like. So something has to happen. We have to rebalance the world if we are to deliver on sustainability. Here's another indication of that, CO2 emissions per capita. Just look at the industrialized countries at top here compared to the emerging economies. Of course, this is also affected by some economic structure in the countries, leading to Saudi Arabia and Russia as examples of being relatively high on this scale. And of course, our energy use is high. It's still dominated by fossil fuels, and therefore our per capita emissions far outweigh those of the 1.4 billion people in India, the 300 million in Nigeria, to be 400 million by the 2050. So that is also an indication of the imbalance that has to change. And we got to do something about the link between our quality of life, human development, and the use of resources more in general. The richest parts of the world, we have too high resource use in general, whether it's water or food or area or CO2, in order for our lifestyle to be copied by those that are still in the lower part of the Human Development Index. So something has to happen, and more than a nudge has to happen to change the behavior. And then when you ask the question, in which direction is the energy world moving, you can still make very different stories depending on which signpost you decide and choose to assign weight to. So a future driven by some of the factors that we have here on the left side, in red here, will be a very different future than if the world is dominated by those on the right. And so what we've done here is looked at how these signposts might develop. You assign weight to these, make assumptions in terms of growth, in terms of energy efficiency, in terms of technology, climate policies, not only ambitions, market regulations, and geopolitics. And then we can paint very different pictures of where the world might be in 2050. And we do that through scenarios. And then we have two scenarios that capture where the world might be heading at the moment as forecasts, where we look at what's happening outside and we pick different assumptions and we develop forecasts. We call them reform and rivalry, respectively. The reform scenario is a market-driven scenario in a relatively benign geopolitical setting, so friendly competition, if you like, focus on economic growth. Policy drives the development in terms of nationally determined contributions in energy and climate policy, but it's also much more about markets and technology than policy change. It delivers the highest economic growth, but it doesn't deliver sufficient energy transition and emission reductions to be sustainable in terms of achieving Paris targets. It's very much like the STEP scenario in the IEA World Energy Outlook of last year. Rivalry scenario, there we focus more on the possibility that current geopolitical drivers might last, they might persist. That means more populism, it means isolationism, it means focus on energy security, focus on me, not on you, sanctions, trade tensions, isolationism, more slower technology development, and more dependence on your own resources. And that might lead to more coal use, as an example, than in the reform case. That's a scenario with lower growth, higher emissions, and not a scenario that we would like to be in, but something we cannot exclude happening. The third scenario is a normative scenario. It's a backcast. What is needed to deliver on sustainable development? All the 17 sustainable development goals from the UN, including a well below 2-degree target. It's not a 1.5-degree target. It's a scenario. It's 1.7, 1.8 degrees. And it requires immediate and coordinated, unprecedented international action in terms of energy and climate policy, just like the IEA net zero emission scenario that was just published, but not at the same scale and not with the same speed. And I'll show that. It's a truly challenging scenario, very difficult to see that happening right now, but cannot be excluded either, just like the rivalry scenario. And then we get very, very different outcomes in terms of key variables, if you like. What will the world look like in 2050? Well, it depends. Different size of the global economy, massive variation in energy-related CO2 emissions, down from 33, but only to 32 in a rivalry case, or all the way down to 9 in a rebalance case in terms of billion tons. Look at the dispersion of oil demand. I'll come back to that. Variation in gas demand. This is the share of renewable electricity, solar and wind in the global electricity mix. That's a massive growth in all scenarios, from 7% today up to 32 in a rivalry case and 52 in a rebalance case. And in terms of EV penetration, electric light-duty vehicles, the number of vehicles will vary a lot, because the size of the fleet will vary in these three scenarios. So you can paint very different pictures of the global energy world in 2050 through these scenarios. So, and this is what it looks like in terms of GDP growth. So the world will be almost twice as large in economic terms, in purchasing power, 2 billion more people, economic growth in the area of below to up to slightly above 2% per year. Much better development in energy intensity or energy efficiency, if you like, in the case of the rebalance case than what we've seen historically, so that we use less energy. In the rebalance case, we decouple primary energy demand from GDP growth, so we use less primary energy in a rebalance case, in spite of the world being a much larger place. The rebalance case, of course, then also delivers a massive transition, massive reduction in fossil fuels, more nuclear, more hydroelectricity, much more new renewables. New renewables grow in all scenarios. The difference is that we don't get fossil fuel demand sufficiently down and the energy efficiency improvement sufficiently large in the reform and the rivalry cases. So then this is what the CO2 pathways look like. The three lines here are the three scenarios. The rebalance case, the reform case, and a rivalry case. Rebalance is, as I said, consistent with something like 1.7, 1.8 degree warming, depending on what you think about the development after 2050. That scenario delivers a de facto net zero development in the industrialized world. And China, in that scenario, will be well on its way to achieve net zero by 2060, which is its ambition. But the rest of the world, the emerging regions, will not be net zero yet by 2050. They need a few more decades, in spite of and because of their development, because of the growth in population. The economic growth is highest there. We get significant emission reductions, but we don't get them to net zero, even in the rebalance case. I compare this here with 3 IEA scenarios, and most notably the recent net zero emission scenario, which IEA has presented, which is also very much in line with the net zero scenarios coming out of this consortium of central banks recently as well. The big difference is what has to happen the next decade compared to the rebalance case. The speed of change and the scale. And if we combine IEA's CCS assumptions with ours, so we take out our CCS assumptions, which are 2 billion tons by 2050. We add in the IEA assumptions of 7.6 billion tons. Our rebalance trajectory is very close to that of the net zero scenario by 2050. But the difference is still large in the beginning. And this is what these 1.5 degree scenarios require, is this massive change basically yesterday to deliver this change to 2030 and then to 2040. Because the carbon budget there is so limited. And if you compare our rebalance case here to other variables in the IEA net zero emission scenario, you can see the big change in assumptions. They assume that oil demand can come down by 40% over the next decade to 60 million barrels by 2030. And of course, that requires a massive growth in nuclear, massive growth in hydroelectricity, and a lot of other investments to make that possible, which is not happening at the moment, by the way. So it's the speed and the scale in the beginning, which is the biggest difference. And then by 2050, they have much more electricity. And as a consequence of that, of course, much more of that will be renewables than in our case. But sort of the tools, the variables with which you deliver either our rebalance scenario or IEA's net zero emission scenario are the same. It's just the scale and scope of them, and whether it's possible to combine that with their very high economic growth rate assumption, by the way. So in our scenarios, then, where are the different energy markets moving? Well, talking about electricity first, we will have a massive growth in electricity in all scenarios, up to a doubling almost in the rebalance case, 60% increase in the rivalry case. All growth in electricity generation will come, net growth will come from renewables, new renewables, so solar and wind, basically. Even in a reform case, electricity by 2050 delivered from solar parks and wind turbines will be as large as all fossil fuel electricity is today. And in a rebalance case, the generation from solar and wind turbines, solar panels and wind turbines will be as large as all of electricity is today. That electricity demand is coming, for instance, from the transport sector. So we have much growth in electricity in road transport in all the scenarios, sufficiently so, if you like, only in a rebalance case, where 90% of all light-duty vehicles are electric by 2040 and basically 100% by 2050. Remaining oil use in long-haul trucking, in terms of road transport, much more efficient transport, so we use less energy. Much less transport in terms of fewer cars on the road as well, because that is replaced by some non-road transport like public transport, rail, etc., which will be electric, more electric. The remaining non-road transportation also needs some oil, because we do not think we can do all kinds of international shipping and aviation without the use of oil, even though we're going to test some hydrogen and we're going to do more biofuels. Very often when you talk about climate change and the need for energy transition, we stop when we've talked about the decarbonization of electricity generation and electrification of transport. But a lot of energy use is in other sectors as well. But this is the manufacturing sector to the left, where we use all the energy is being used to produce all the stuff we need, all the cars we use, all the wind turbines that we need. That will be more energy efficient in all scenarios, but in particular in a rebalance case, it will be more electric, but there will still be some fossil fuels left. Then with 2 billion more people, we need to build many more buildings, maybe 800 to 1 million to 1 billion more houses, plus office spaces. That will need energy. We will have much more efficient buildings. They will be more electric in all cases. But they still need some gas, we think, and some oil, but hardly any in a rebalance case. This will basically be very little of non-renewable or non-low carbon sources of energy in the building sector. And just as an example, in the IEA case, what they've in addition assumed in order to get to the net zero reality is requirements of maximum temperature indoor in people's homes at 68 degrees Fahrenheit during the winter. That's not the case in Norway during the winter. We have much warmer houses, and a minimum temperature indoor, which is, I guess, 75 Fahrenheit during the summer in order to get there. So these are also some of the measures that probably have to be put in here. And then we have a growing source of energy demand, which is feedstock, oil and gas. We will use more oil and gas for producing stuff in all the products that are today made by oil and gas, we think, in spite of a lot of focus on plastics and waste and recycling. But that is a growing component of oil and gas demand. We don't have the tools available to model hydrogen. If it hadn't been for COVID, hydrogen would probably have been the word of fashion in the energy sector last year, and it still is. But in order to have a view on hydrogen, we need to model it based on a non-existent market for hydrogen as an energy carrier. We don't find hydrogen anywhere. We have to make it from something. So we have to create assumptions and markets, and we haven't done that in our modeling. And to be honest, I don't think very many other people have done that either. But what we do is we add it as a sensitivity. And what we've done, we compare here with the rebalance case. We assume hydrogen will potentially, with the right framework conditions, develop as a market where it can be used as a carbon-free energy carrier, replacing oil, in particular in manufacturing and in transport and in some of the power sectors. It can also replace coal and gas in the power sector, but we have to decide how to produce it. And in the beginning, we will have to produce it as blue hydrogen, which is then fossil fuels with carbon capture and storage. In China, mainly probably from coal, because they don't have surplus gas. In Europe, from gas, probably in the United States as well, if we need hydrogen. Then we need more carbon capture and storage. And in our case, we go from 2 billion tons of carbon capture to 3.5, so 75% more CCS in this scenario with hydrogen added than we have in the proper rebalance scenario. Gradually, we will see green hydrogen when we have surplus renewable electricity, where we then produce hydrogen in electrolysis, 9 liters of water, 9 kilos of water per kilo of hydrogen. So we need water. And a large part of the hydrogen then by 2050 is assumed to be coming from renewables. With that combination of how to get to hydrogen, we can reduce CO2 emissions by another 30% by 2050. But we need 75% more carbon capture and storage. So there's no silver bullet, there's no free lunch here, and there's no market today. And then with the oil and gas demand in these scenarios, I'm sorry to say that the chief economist of Scandinavia's largest company, an energy company, I'm not able to forecast oil demand. I have 3 very different outcomes here. It could be 50 million barrels, it could be 90, or it could be 115, or anywhere between. But our conclusion is that even in a rebalance case where oil demand comes back down to the level it had around 1980 by 2050, if you compare it with the supply that would come out of existing supply with enhanced oil recovery. So we do what the IEA tells us we can in their net zero emission scenario, is to continue to invest in existing fields. Oil supply would be 25 roughly. So that whole white space here is new oil coming from resources that have been discovered but haven't been made into reserves yet, or new exploration. That's 280 billion barrels over the next 30 years. That is more oil than OPEC has delivered over the last 20 in a rebalance case. So we have to invest in oil as well, and even more so in gas. 60 trillion cubic meters of new gas is more than North America, the Middle East, and Russia in combination have delivered over the last 30 years. And in addition, we have to invest in all these new sources of energy and infrastructure and energy efficiency and so on. So the investment numbers are massive. Then just in summary, if we are to deliver on a sustainable development and a sustainable energy transition, where we also deliver on all the other sustainable development goals, we have to change what hasn't changed over the last 30 years. And something that has never happened in the history of humankind is that we decouple growth in energy demand from growth in the economy. Over the last 30 years, total final consumption of energy has gone up roughly by 65%. Electricity has grown. Nuclear has been roughly stable. All fossil fuels have grown, with the exception of coal, the last decade. And in terms of electricity, it has grown. All sources of electricity has grown, with the exception of nuclear. And we can see at the end the growth in renewables. If we are to deliver on the energy transition over the next 30 years, we will have to decouple growth in energy demand from growth in the economy. Electricity will take a massive role so that we can phase out more of the other sources of primary energy. And we will basically rebuild the electricity sector completely while making it twice as large as it is today. And that's what we have to do. Nothing less, nothing more. But it's an enormous challenge. We think it's possible, but it's not realistic in any likelihood sense of the word. The two other scenarios are also possible, and that area between them in outcome space is probably somewhere in there will most likely happen and end up. So with that, I just conclude my slideshow, and I guess we're ready for Q&A.
Excellent presentation, Eric. And as usual, you highlighted all of the uncertainties, which I think is refreshing in many ways. We've had a couple of questions come in, and a couple of them actually link pretty closely to some things I was going to ask. So I'll just kind of dive right in. One of them is related specifically to minerals and mining. And in the cases that you've analyzed, have you assessed what the way the viewer actually puts it, the doability of increasing mining, but have you assessed what the increase in mining needs will be? How does that juxtapose with what IEA has done recently? And what's the net impact on emissions? This is kind of getting into a life cycle question a little bit.
No, we haven't done it directly. We have some figures on the need for batteries and so on, but and suffice to say that we agree very much with the conclusions in the IEA net zero emission scenario. If we're going in this direction, we will need something like a 7-fold increase in mining, as an example. They say within the next decade. We think it will take longer, and that's one of the reasons why the rebalance case is slower in terms of emission reductions, because we won't have enough renewable electricity if we don't have that type of increase in mining. We won't have enough batteries to take out fossil fuels in the transport sector sufficiently fast. And there's something also that if we start now with an increase in mining, we will have increased emissions, because we can't do mining without using fossil fuels. In the same way, we can't vaccinate people without using plastics. So, and that's one of the challenges here, is that are we able to increase and it's not only the mining, but it's the manufacturing process as well, in terms of getting stuff out of, and transport, getting stuff out of the mines to the refiners, to the factories, and then into batteries or steel or whatever it is going to be. So that's a very capital intensive process, which needs a lot of electricity, and it needs a lot of activity, and which is one of the challenges here. But that is one of the things that have to happen. And then if we are to do that as efficiently as possible, we also need to do it in a geopolitically very benign setting where we cooperate on this, and where it's okay that some countries will dominate some of this business, whether it's Congo or Chile or China or the United States for that matter, where you have a lot of resources, right? So it's one of the challenges of being able to provide enough minerals in a sustainable manner.
So that actually, you just touched on something that I was gonna ask later in, but I'll just jump to it now. You made a comment about in the outlooks, actually in all the outlooks, the increase in the rate of electrification of economies globally. And then as you were sort of wrapping, you also commented that at the same time, particularly in the rebalance case, if we're going to double electrification, but also rebuild the entire architecture. That raises all kinds of questions, in addition to the capital intensity of those types of activities, the amount of investment that needs to occur, but also it relates to a host of issues related to siting, land availability, policy interdiction in certain cases. and this varies dramatically on a global scale from country to country, region to region, et cetera. How much of that do you consider when you're looking at these cases, or do you just recognize that as a potential uncertainty that is kind of difficult to grapple with?
Yeah, it is. So yeah, it's a bit of both. It's uncertain, and there's an uncertainty there. It's difficult to model, but taking it into account leads to sort of it serves as a brake on our ability to transition sufficiently fast. And then in a rebalance case, you have to assume that away. And in the IEA net zero emission, you have assumed it away. And then it just happens, right? Things like protests against onshore wind developments because of the impact on nature, which we have both in Norway and in Germany. So now we have to move offshore in terms of offshore wind. We just had 2 days ago, the Australian government said no to a massive electrolysis solar panel electrolysis hydrogen export plan in a plant in Western Australia, which has been on the drawing board for 7-8 years, in an area which basically have no people. But there are wetlands, there are animals there, and of course that will slow down the ability to then export large amounts of ammonia and hydrogen out of clean energy in Australia. So all those issues are, and the same with mining, the same with power infrastructure. How do you rebuild the power infrastructure in a city like Paris? Which you need to do if you are going to charge your car on the curb, because the local grid is also a challenge, right? So that's so all of this you have to assume in a way. You have to assume a policy which makes it possible to invest sufficiently fast. Power lines will have to be underground because people don't like them above ground, etc., etc. So but it's different assumption because you can't model it in detail, and especially not on a regional zonal level. But it's the assumptions that drive then the differences in the scenarios. And in a rebalance case, you have to assume them away. It's we're going to do this.
Yeah, no, that's thanks for saying that. I mean, that's something that I often get questions about when people see extreme cases. They get nervous that maybe that's the new path that is being set and that policymakers are striving for. And I think striving for something and recognizing realities on the ground are often very different things. And I brought that up because you mentioned the U.S. certainly has a lot of resources, but getting a new mine commissioned to do anything has been nothing short of a Herculean effort, and nothing's really happened anytime recently. So it's certainly a big point of uncertainty to consider. And the fact that a lot of like the world's lithium processing, for example, is in China. That's obviously a geopolitical issue that pushes us maybe towards the rivalry case in terms of potential realities. But it's interesting the spread that you've shown there. There's a really interesting question here that relates to assumptions about technology that I want to put to you, because these are always the most difficult things to grapple with, I think, when you're doing forecasting. One of our viewers actually asked a question about carbon capture technologies and what the potential impacts could be on what you've done. You mentioned carbon capture sort of in passing, and you even talked about it in hydrogen with regard to blue hydrogen. But there are a host of other colors in the hydrogen rainbow, and there are a host of other potential carbon capture technologies. And it's an interesting one. And you said it appropriately with regard to hydrogen, right? It's hard to model these things because we don't have anything to go on, right? It's a lot of assumption, speculation. But I wonder if you've actually looked closely at ways to increase the efficiency of carbon capture, direct air capture technologies, and how those are incorporated into your analyses.
Yeah, we've looked at some of them, and of course, I mean, in order to deliver on the type of global efficient development that we have, both in a reform and in a rebalance case, if you look at sort of the at the macro level, the link between GDP development and energy use, what we basically have to assume is that all kinds of manufacturing or energy related processes will become much more efficient than they are today. So there's a massive number of small technological breakthroughs, if you like, everything from digitalization to combustion engine remaining efficiency, logistics planning, goods transport going to be much different, and also all the energy related technologies. So the amount of energy we need to capture CO2 out of the air. If we don't solve that equation, if we don't make that more efficient, we can't deliver on these macro variables. But then the specifics of some of these technologies we don't have in we don't have in any big numbers or any details on the model. That goes for cold fusion, which is one option. And that also goes for direct air capture. In the case of direct air capture, we don't think it's going to make a big dent on CO2 emission or CO2 capture globally the next 30 years. They might, and IEA has some heroic assumption on that in the net zero emissions. I think they have 1.9 billion tons out of the 7.5 they have. I think is those types of technologies. It's the same way we're not natural sinks. How do we establish markets for that? How the control mechanisms? How do we account for the trees that are growing in Canada and Russia and Scandinavia that capture? So that is also going to be part of this. One of the issues with all these technology hopes that we have is also they will be there, but will they be scalable? Will we be able to make them big enough? And to put it into perspective, the 1.9 billion tons that IEA has put in terms of direct air capture, that's a mass of CO2, which is roughly equal to current global steel production. So it's equivalent in mass to all the steel we're moving around the world producing. And by the way, we're probably going to make much more steel. We have to because of the infrastructure. So the 2 billion tons we have in carbon capture and storage today, we're building one facility. I mean, we've done carbon capture for 30 years now, but the post combustion is a different story. We're building one facility now where we can sell storage capacity to Europe in an old reservoir offshore. When that's fully built out, it's 5 million tons per year. The full phase one, 5 million tons. And we can sell that. But 2 billion tons is what we need globally in 30 years. That's 400 of those plants over the next 30 years. That's more than one a month. And these facilities generally take 3 to 5 years to build. So the speed, the scalability is what is challenging. But and we will develop that technology. But if it takes 5 years, then we're only going to get so far to 2050.
Sure, that actually raises a really interesting point because scalability is obviously critical, and what Equinor has been doing in many ways has to be replicated around the world by other entities as well. Mm-hmm. And one of our viewers actually asked a question about who does what. And it's a great question because you've seen, and Equinor has actually experienced this a little bit as well, but the shift in capital budgeting towards greener energy technologies, more renewables, away from fossil fuels, you sort of demonstrated in your outlooks the white space, right? The gap, mm-hmm. if you will, between what the world will need and what would be produced if we just sort of operated in things that we know about to be existing and in the work, so to speak. But it begs the question: who's going to make up that gap if the super majors, who are arguably the most efficient and most productive in this space, are moving away from it? And it begs an interesting question with regard to if it's NOCs, if it's new smaller companies that aren't necessarily as ESG motivated. What does that mean for the outlook?
No, it's a very relevant question, and what I see and what we see is that increasingly some of the IOCs are moving away from taking responsibility for supplying the world with energy. We're going so far and so fast into the renewable space, and at the same time, our competitors in BP is one example. They said that we're going to reduce our oil and gas production by 40% to 2030. So who's going to take the responsibility for supplying the world with energy? the IOCs will be there. We are absolutely necessary in terms of driving the energy transition as actors, because we have the risk capabilities, we have the financial muscle, at least as long as we have oil and gas revenues at $75 a barrel or $10 per MMBTU now in the European gas market. Satisfying demand for oil, if we pull out, will be, and increasingly we will be much more dependent than we are today on OPEC resources, in particular in the Middle East. That's where the reserves are. That's where the low-cost barrels are. Some of them are also really carbon efficient to get out. In a geopolitically benign setting, which is in our mind an absolutely prerequisite for this happening, the rebalance type of energy transition, it's okay. And it's probably necessary. We need to allow them to have those revenues to also facilitate their transition. We can only so long depend on shale oil, even at the 10 million barrels per day. It's not going to grow. It's not going to be as flexible. So, and it's the same with mining. But of course, in a rivalry setting where we don't trust each other, where we would like to have Exxon do that project in Guyana and not Rosneft or the Guyana National Oil Company, then we will also be in a world where it's going to be very difficult to solve the energy challenge, the climate challenge, and the transition. Yeah. And of course, but we also see it on the other side now is that our competitors and colleagues, if you like, and peers in a company like Ørsted, the large Danish renewable offshore wind gigantic company. They don't like competition, right? They complain now that with the likes of Equinor and BP and Shell moving into the offshore wind space, we're competing away the profits. We're making it difficult to compete, and the supply of projects is not sufficient to the demand from different types of financial actors here. So they were out now saying that they're worried that with our financial muscles we're going to be too tough competitors. Yeah,
that's a really interesting statement. Yeah, that is a really interesting. One of the things I've actually contended is just the global need for energy. I mean, you highlighted the imbalance that exists, right? It's very much a world of haves and have-nots when you think about energy access. And at the end of the day, we're going to need everything. We just need to figure out how to do it more sustainably. And you highlight efficiency as a very important marker for achieving greater energy access and the goals, the Paris goals in particular, but the rebalance scenario. I think the efficiency gains were the greatest in that particular scenario. That, of course, is a technology assumption as well, but also an end-use assumption. It's interesting to see all of that, because what that highlights is an energy market globally that is becoming more competitive, right? And for consumers, that's great, right? But it really does highlight the need for entities like the IOCs who can manage those types of environments in a way that still sustains profitability and the ability to expand and deliver energy services. So it's definitely, I know this is a question, which is why I decided to ask it when I saw it come up, because I was going to ask it anyway. It's a question that's on a lot of people's minds, right? Who is going to do what as we go forward? You mentioned, a greater reliance on NOCs in the Middle East in particular, and in the rebalance scenario where everything's great, that's okay. History serves a bit of a different picture when you think about, that. So I think that's going to be interesting, and definitely interesting to watch. But this actually begs another question that I wrote down almost right out of the gate when you started talking, that I wanted to ask, and it had to do with the response to COVID-19 globally, and how we've seen, particularly in the industrialized world, significant fiscal muscles flex to keep the lights on, so to speak, to keep the economy so that they can recover as we start to move out of this crisis. But there is a sort of lingering question that I have, and I wonder if you could address it. It has to do with a combination of very aggressive fiscal policy as well as loose monetary policy. It kind of sets the stage for a real risk of economies overheating and significant inflationary pressures. And you sort of referred to that at the outset. I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit. and how you think that might play into any of those three scenarios you laid out through 2050. Sort of us moving from where we are right now and onto one of those paths, because the more volatility on the upfront, part of those paths that there is, it creates a lot of natural questions about which one we might ultimately land on. So
yeah,
I wonder if you could comment on that.
Well, I think, I mean, there's a very large number of dimensions to that question. One of them is, of course, that also, I mean, part of the main thrust of the fiscal spending plans are not geared towards stimulating the energy transition. Right. They're steered towards getting people back to work, restoring the service sector, so allow people to start to transport themselves again, so that we get the economy going. That will lead to, and it does lead to, higher energy demand and higher emissions. So that's one aspect of this. We will potentially be overheating parts of the economy, especially relative to the supply chain's ability to deliver without increasing costs. That will increase prices. It could increase interest rates. Then that increases the risk for governments having to start paying back their debts at a higher rate or with higher interest rates. There's something about the trust in the financial markets as well. If that goes down, you get increased risk premiums. You get higher requirements of return for an insurance company that could go in and invest in an offshore wind with a project with a guaranteed price. So the money might become less available for that type of investments in bond-like financial instruments as well. If the government has to start paying back its debt, we're talking about tax increases, which will lower economic growth. It will also allow for less spending on the necessary subsidies that we have to put in place here, in order, because the government has to do its part here as well, which is to subsidize some of these technologies until they're sufficiently mature to run by themselves. Whether we're talking floating offshore wind, still offshore wind, hydrogen, CCS, how do you stimulate consumers to change their behavior? So high debt ratios among governments increases the likelihood of higher taxes or lower subsidies, slowing down the economic growth, slowing down parts of the energy transition as well. So this is and that looks like in a rivalry scenario, type of scenario, when we don't trust each other and where we put sanctions in place if we don't like you. That's a scenario with less trust. In a rebalance case, we think we need to have the trust level, which is also then associated with relatively low risk premiums on the general financial parameters, if you like. So this all hangs together, and all of the factors that we've talking about or have been talking about now reduce the likelihood of a rebalance scenario happening anytime soon. So it's there's a lot of the things that we have to do here as energy companies now is that we lack the line of sight to profitability without support, right? So if we depend on support, some kind of support, customers paying, consumers paying, taxpayers paying, or government subsidizing, if we lack that, we will slow down the ability and the willingness to invest.
Sure. Yeah, that's thanks for that response. That's actually some interesting insight, because I think too often, I'm glad you were very candid with that, because too often we hear 3 or 4 different scenarios presented, and rarely is there a discussion about the transition from right now to a particular path. So I think that's very useful. It should actually be a more prominent feature of these types of discussions, because it really does set the stage for, if you want to do something, this is what's going to happen in the near term, right? Which is very much about paving a path. There is an interesting question here that I was going to ask you in a different way, but so I'll kind of try to weave the question that our viewer asked in with what I was going to ask. You referred to natural sinks kind of in passing in your remarks, and there's a lot of interest in kind of redefining the agricultural sector to not only reduce its GHG emission footprint, but also turn it into a net sink. And there's a lot of different potential pathways that could be taken there, from regenerative grazing to different agricultural practices and farming, like no-till plowing, stuff like that. There's a lot of things that are being proposed and tested and tried. I wonder, in the outlook that you generated, how much of that you took on board with regard to what it could mean for net CO2 emissions and the net zero aspirations, because for practical purposes, if you can address the agricultural footprint and turn it in from a net emitter to a net sink, it could be massively important in achieving these types of net zero aspirations.
Yeah, no, well, our scenarios are basically about the energy related emissions. And none of my team is an expert on agriculture, but it is definitely a very important aspect of this whole transition to keep in mind. It's our ability to reduce the footprint of different sectors, including agriculture, but at the same time then produce food and potentially be available as a natural sink as efficiently as possible as well. And some of the sustainable ways of producing agriculture might not be as energy efficient as industrialized agriculture does today. So if the flip side of a more sustainable way of producing agriculture is a higher use of energy, at least in a transition, then that's an equation that has to be balanced as well. There's something about the distribution of the output of agriculture that has an impact here. How do we ensure that people don't starve and people don't overeat while we produce sufficient amounts of foodstuff? Maybe, but it's the wrong kind and it's in the wrong places. How do we transport the food to those that need it? 2 billion more people on Earth by 2050. We're going to need more food. Potential area conflicts between biofuels and natural sinks, one aspect. The biofuels and food is another one. But what if we need the forests to grow or to stand there longer until we cut them down because of the natural sinks ability, or their ability to be natural sinks? So there, and as in many of the energy transition issues as well, it's also a massive market design regulatory problem. Who do you trust? If we were to go and buy a piece of land in Russia and say that we're going to leave that forest growing, and we want to count those that increased CO2 binding for a period against our own emissions, and the Russian authorities said it was okay, do you think that would be accepted by Europe or the United States? How do you set up those types of mechanisms here? So that is also and if you look at Brazil, when they presented their net zero ambition, it came with a caveat that they're going to have international financing on the part of their net zero ambitions that is also related to their natural sinks. So that's a financial market that has to be regulated in line with CO2 emissions and CO2 taxes and all that stuff. Again, requiring trust.
Yeah, you're getting at the core of. I've been involved in a lot of these types of nature-based solutions discussions, and at the center of all of it is measurement and verification.
Yeah.
Right? And this is something, it's an evolving space. But it's definitely an interesting one. And,
yeah.
And that speaks volumes to what you just mentioned about trust. So
yeah. No, and I use this as a sort of a maybe sometimes ridiculous example, but the picture that I have behind me is my hometown, right? And the mountain behind me there didn't have any trees in 1940. Because we used the wood for burning, right? Yeah. But now those mountains around that city are fully covered with forest, but we don't count it in our CO2 emission accounts, right? So and how could we? Or could we? The Scandinavian forests are growing, right? Because we use less wood than we did many years ago. But we don't take it into account in the way we talk about the CO2 emissions either.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. So I did have there's actually another question, and It relates to, you did the comparison between the rebalance case and the IEA net zero by 2050 case. And it talks in the IEA net zero case, it talks about investment in the energy sector having to rise, dramatically, almost by a factor of 4, right? From 1.3 trillion to 4.3 trillion just by 2030. Um, Given everything that we've discussed so far with regard to the stimulus and the risks, and I wonder if you could comment on what do you think it will take for that to happen? Is this going to have to be a government-driven initiative? Is this something that the broader investment community is going to have to figure out a way to finance in a way that they haven't really ever financed before? Maybe there's various ESG and sustainability metrics that get worked into return to capital metrics or something like that. I mean, there's a lot of different ways you could potentially paint this. I wonder if you've thought much about that, and if you have, if you could share your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, at the end of the day, I guess the financial capital for this could be printed by the central banks, right? But it's one key question is, of course, how do you ensure that the resources that we put into to make these real investments will move in that direction sufficiently fast? And of course, it is a massive challenge. And in particular, when you think about the biggest change are the biggest changes in parts of the energy spectrum that is characterized by zero marginal cost or falling average costs, right? Things like electricity grids, things like renewable electricity, things that needs a source of regulation to work as a market. So because if we overinvest in wind turbines, we risk producing electricity at zero cost, which is a zero price unless you regulate it.
Yeah.
And we still don't have that market design. So there's a lot of market design issues that have to be handled here. The government has to stimulate establishing markets that makes it sufficiently safe for insurance companies, sovereign wealth funds like the Norwegian one, the foreign exchange reserves of China, to actually transfer their investments out of the bank, if it sits there in a government bond type of instrument, or out of other parts of the stock market, and then move it into these types of activities. The underlying assumption is, of course, that this can also happen without crashing economic growth, so that the economy is also the expansion of the economy is one of the sources of this type of capital. Whether we can triple it or quadruple it until 2040 or whatever, it also depends on the rate of return in other types of activities. With the world, we invest in a lot in the world, and it's not only in energy, but here we have to invest much more in energy infrastructure. We have to make it sensible for a homeowner to take on his or her energy efficiency investments. You have to insulate your homes better. We have to insulate our homes. We have to replace inefficient gas heaters with electric heat pumps, and then avoid us to increase the temperature during the winter and lower the temperature during the summer, because then we take out the efficiency improvement in comfort factors, if you like. So it's also getting more bang for the buck. This is not only about the money. It's investing in smaller cars, which goes the wrong direction compared to what we have been doing, right? SUVs is the biggest part of the investment on cars. But the money is it's about shifting resources, but within a growing economy. It's about financing mechanisms that makes it possible to do it. How do you ensure 750 million people get access to energy over the next decade? They're not in the United States or in Norway. They're somewhere else, but we probably have to be part of the financing through our sovereign wealth fund, through the financing mechanism in the Paris Agreement, etc. And we need governments, we need regulatory signals that makes that possible.
Absolutely.
And it has to compete with other uses of the capital.
No, absolutely. I mean, that's the one thing is true about capital and the way it's allocated. It's always going to try to find the greatest return. So that is certainly true. So we are right up against it on time. So I want to close with a final question, Eric. And it's related to what we've just been through with COVID and are still emerging from. Anytime you develop a long-term outlook, uh, it's inevitably people will ask, well, what's the next big, quote unquote, black swan event, right? Well, if we could predict that, we'd be in a very different place. But I wonder if you've thought much about that, and what you think could be the biggest potential impediment to any of these pathways emerging.
Yeah, that's we actually wrote about the pandemic in Energy Perspectives for I think in 2018. So as one of the cases, one of the things that could happen. So and then it did. We wrote about Brexit as well before it happened. And talking about black swan events, we found a black swan here in Norway 3 weeks ago on our biking trip, and that's probably escaped from the UK and the Netherlands. It doesn't exist here, and it's actually blacklisted. We don't want it because it ruins the reproduction of the white swans. But no, of course there's. I mean. On the technology side, on the supply side, there are things that could either increase or reduce the possibility of achieving any of this. But recurring, I mean, a pandemic can happen again. Yeah, there are some natural disasters that are always lurking in the background. The one I've been worrying about is what happens if the Yellowstone volcano erupts, which we can't predict. So there are many of these things that we can't predict. I think on the technology side, cold fusion, but again, it's about scalability. On the demand side, it's to what extent does the increased focus on the climate challenge and the climate threat have an impact on future consumers' consumption patterns? Do rich middle class consumers in India in 2040, do they use their money for the type of resource intensive consumption that we do, or don't they? If they don't, we have a much better chance of arriving at some of these sustainable scenarios. But the question is, what do they then use their money for? So that's the consumer behavior is a kind of a necessary black swan here on the demand side.
Absolutely. Well, we are up against it on time, Eric. Thank you so much for spending the last hour with us, sharing your insights and sharing the energy perspectives, and definitely open invitation for you to be here in Houston with us. And I'd look forward to seeing you in person sooner rather than later. So
same here. I hope to be here. Just got to get my second shot first.
There you go.
Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.